Chapter 4. The Hidden Door. The night had fallen over Willow Creek, a blanket of stars scattered across the dark sky, the air thick with a sense of anticipation. Ava stood in her living room, staring at the locket Ethan had given her. She could feel the weight of it in her hand, both the physical weight and the burden of the secrets it represented. She had barely slept since Ethan left, her mind racing with questions and fears. What had her grandmother been hiding? And why had Ethan come back after all these years to find it? A soft knock at her door broke the silence, and Ava's heart jumped. She crossed the room quickly, her hand pausing on the doorknob. She took a deep breath before opening the door. Ethan stood there, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the porch lamp. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice barely louder than a whisper. Ava nodded, her stomach churning with a mix of fear and excitement. She grabbed her coat from the hook by the door and stepped outside, closing the door behind her. The night air was cool, and the sound of crickets filled the silence as they began to walk. Ethan led her through the quiet streets of Willow Creek, his steps sure and confident. Ava walked beside him, her eyes darting around nervously. She had grown up in this town, knew every corner and every alley, but tonight it felt different, like a place out of time, shrouded in mystery. "Where are we going?" Ava asked, her voice trembling slightly. Ethan glanced at her, his eyes catching the moonlight. "There's a place your grandmother used to go, a place she kept secret from everyone. It's where she hid the key." Ava swallowed hard, her mind racing with questions. Why did she hide it? What does it open? Ethan's gaze turned forward, his expression darkening. "The key opens a door that was never meant to be opened, a door that leads to something dangerous, something that your grandmother tried to protect the world from." Ava shivered, the weight of his words sinking in. She had always known her grandmother was a woman of secrets, but she had never imagined anything like this. They walked in silence for a while longer, the only sound the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel path. Eventually, they reached the edge of the woods. Ethan paused, turning to look at Ava. "This is it. Are you sure you want to do this?" Ava met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. She was terrified, but she knew she couldn't turn back now. She had to know the truth. "I'm sure," she said, her voice steady. Ethan nodded, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. He turned and led her into the woods, the trees closing in around them. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Ava followed closely behind, her eyes darting around nervously. They walked for what felt like hours, the forest growing darker and denser with each step. Finally, they reached a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old stone well, covered in moss and vines. It looked ancient, as if it had been there for centuries, forgotten by time. Ethan approached the well, his hand resting on the edge. He looked back at Ava, his eyes serious. "This is where she hid it," he said softly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flashlight, clicking it on and shining it down into the well. Ava stepped closer, peering into the darkness. The well was deep, the bottom obscured by shadows. She could see something glinting faintly in the light, something metallic, half buried in the dirt at the bottom. "How do we get it out?" Ava asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan looked at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "That's where you come in." He reached into his bag and pulled out a length of rope, handing it to her. "Think you can handle it?" Ava took the rope, her hands trembling slightly. She nodded, her eyes meeting his. "I can do it." Ethan secured the rope to a nearby tree, testing it to make sure it was stable. He turned back to Ava, his expression serious. "Be careful. If anything goes wrong, I'll pull you back up. Just give me a signal." Ava nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath and grabbed the rope, swinging her legs over the edge of the well. She began to lower herself down, the rough stone walls scraping against her skin as she descended into the darkness. The air grew colder the deeper she went, the light from Ethan's flashlight growing dimmer above her. She could hear her own breathing, the sound echoing off the stone walls. Finally, her feet touched the bottom, and Ava let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She knelt down, her fingers brushing against the dirt. She could see the glint of metal, the key. It was old, the surface tarnished and worn, but it was unmistakably a key. Ava picked it up, her fingers closing around it tightly. "I've got it!" she called up, her voice echoing in the narrow space. Ethan's face appeared above her, his eyes filled with relief. "Good, hold on, I'm pulling you up." Ava held onto the rope as Ethan began to pull, the key clutched tightly in her hand. Slowly, she was lifted out of the well, the walls of the well passing by her as she ascended. When she finally reached the top, Ethan grabbed her arm, helping her over the edge. She sat on the ground, her breath coming in gasps. Ethan knelt beside her, his eyes on the key in her hand. "That's it," he said softly, his voice filled with awe. "That's the key." Ava looked down at the key, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of it, the responsibility that came with it. She looked up at Ethan, her eyes filled with determination. "What now?" Ethan met her gaze, his expression serious. "Now we find the door, and we make sure it stays closed." Ava nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this was only the beginning. The real danger lay ahead, and she would need all her strength to face it. But she also knew she wasn't alone. She had Ethan by her side, and together they would uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. End of Chapter 4. In Chapter 4, Ava and Ethan venture deeper into the mystery, discovering the key hidden by Ava's grandmother. This chapter sets the stage for the challenges and dangers they will face as they try to understand the significance of the key and the door it unlocks. Stay tuned for the next chapter and don't forget to subscribe. Sayonara.